Racist teacher bullies black girl in class, unaware she is the daughter of the principal. Before we begin, we would like to know where in the world you are watching our videos from. Drop your location in the comment section. Kelly sat in the back seat of her family's car, clutching her backpack tightly in her lap. She stared out the window at the unfamiliar houses and streets as her dad drove toward her new school. Today was the first day at Brightwood Elementary, and while she had been looking forward to it, her stomach was now full of butterflies. Her dad, Mr. Johnson, glanced at her in the rearview mirror and smiled. "You excited, sweetheart? It's a fresh start. You'll make lots of friends here." Kelly forced a smile and nodded. She was excited, but also nervous. Moving to a new town meant leaving behind all her old friends. But there was one thing that made this school special. Her dad had just been hired as the principal. She was proud of him, but had decided not to tell anyone at school. She didn't want the other kids to treat her differently because her dad was the boss. She just wanted to be like everyone else. When they pulled up to the school, Kelly's dad gave her an encouraging look. "You're going to do great, Kelly. Remember, if you need anything, I'm just down the hall." "Thanks, Dad," she said, giving him a quick hug before stepping out of the car. She looked at the big brick building in front of her and took a deep breath. This was it, her new beginning. As she entered the classroom, she was greeted by a loud buzz of excited kids, all chatting and getting to know one another. The walls were covered with bright posters, and the desks were arranged in neat rows. Kelly hesitated for a moment, then made her way to an empty seat near the middle of the room. Before she could sit down, a tall woman with short gray hair walked briskly toward her. The woman's face was stern, her lips pressed into a tight line. Kelly recognized her from the school tour. This was Mrs. Miller, her new teacher. "You're the new girl, aren't you?" Mrs. Miller said, her voice sharp. "Yes, I'm Kelly," she said softly, offering a small smile. Mrs. Miller gave her a quick, cold glance, not returning the smile. "Find a seat at the back," she said flatly. "I don't have time for introductions right now." Kelly's heart sank. She had hoped Mrs. Miller would be friendly, like the teachers at her old school. But she did as she was told and moved to the back row. As the other kids continued to laugh and talk, Kelly kept quiet, her eyes glued to her desk. Why did Mrs. Miller seem so angry with her already? Throughout the morning, things didn't get any better. Every time Kelly raised her hand to answer a question, Mrs. Miller ignored her, calling on other students instead. When Kelly finally worked up the courage to ask a question about a math problem, Mrs. Miller gave her a cold look and said, "Maybe if you paid more attention, you wouldn't be confused." Kelly felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She had been paying attention. She just didn't understand the way Mrs. Miller explained it. But the teacher didn't care. Kelly glanced around and noticed a few kids whispering and giggling. She wished she could disappear. As the day went on, Mrs. Miller's comments became meaner. At one point, she looked directly at Kelly and said, "Some students are just lazy. They don't try hard enough." And it shows. Kelly knew the comment was aimed at her. She could feel the other kids' eyes on her, and her heart ached. What had she done to deserve this? She had barely spoken all day, trying to stay out of trouble. But no matter what, Mrs. Miller seemed determined to make her feel small. At lunchtime, Kelly sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at her sandwich. Her mind was racing with questions. Why did Mrs. Miller dislike her so much? Was it because she was new? Or was it something else? The teacher had been friendly with other kids, even the ones who were new like her. Kelly tried to think of anything she might have done wrong, but nothing made sense. She thought about telling her dad what was happening, but the idea made her nervous. What if he got mad and talked to Mrs. Miller? That might make things worse. Kelly didn't want special treatment just because her dad was the principal, but she also didn't want to feel so alone and hurt. As the day dragged on, Mrs. Miller's cold behavior continued. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Kelly gathered her things and rushed out of the classroom before Mrs. Miller could say anything else to make her feel bad. On the way home, her dad asked her how her first day was. Kelly forced another smile and said it was okay, even though her heart was heavy. She didn't want to worry him on his first day as principal, but deep down, she knew something was very wrong. As she sat in her room that evening, staring out the window, Kelly couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Miller's behavior was about more than just her being new. It was something deeper, something she didn't understand yet. Why does Mrs. Miller hate me so much? Kelly wondered, her mind spinning with worry. She didn't know the answer yet, but she had a feeling she was about to find out soon. And it wasn't going to be easy. The days at Brightwood Elementary felt longer and harder for Kelly as time went on. Mrs. Miller's cold treatment never let up. Every morning, Kelly would slip into the classroom and quietly take her seat at the very back of the room, just like Mrs. Miller had ordered on the first day. It was as though the teacher didn't even want her to be seen. At first, Kelly tried to stay positive. Maybe Mrs. Miller just had a bad day, she thought. Maybe things would get better if she worked harder and showed the teacher she was a good student. But no matter how hard she tried, nothing seemed to change. Every time she raised her hand, Mrs. Miller ignored her. If she asked a question, Mrs. Miller rolled her eyes or sighed loudly, as if Kelly was just wasting her time. It wasn't long before the other kids in class began to notice. Some of them, like Sarah and Emma, would glance at Kelly with confused looks, but they didn't say anything. Others, like Jake and Even, followed Mrs. Miller's lead. They started whispering about Kelly, snickering whenever the teacher made a cruel comment. One morning, Mrs. Miller was teaching a math lesson on the board. Kelly was trying her best to follow along, but the numbers didn't make sense to her. She raised her hand timidly, hoping this time Mrs. Miller would help. Instead, Mrs. Miller gave her a cold glare. "What is it now, Kelly?" she snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do you not understand something again?" Kelly swallowed hard, feeling the eyes of the entire class on her. I just don't get this part," she said softly, pointing to the numbers on her worksheet. Mrs. Miller scoffed. "Maybe if you actually paid attention instead of daydreaming all the time, you wouldn't be so behind." She walked over to Kelly's desk, snatched the paper from her hands, and held it up for the class to see. "Look at this. She can't even follow simple instructions. Honestly, I'm surprised you made it to this grade." Kelly's cheeks burned with shame. She wanted to sink into the floor and disappear. Some of the kids giggled, and Jake, who sat a few desks ahead, whispered loudly, "She's so dumb." Tears stung Kelly's eyes, but she blinked them back. She didn't want to give Mrs. Miller the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Still, the words hurt so much. No matter how hard she tried, nothing seemed to be enough for this teacher. Days turned into weeks, and the bullying only got worse. Mrs. Miller would find any excuse to single Kelly out. If something went wrong in the classroom, Mrs. Miller would somehow blame Kelly, even when it wasn't her fault. One afternoon, the class was working on a group project. Mrs. Miller had given each group a set of markers, but the red marker in Kelly's group was missing. Mrs. Miller stormed over to their table, her eyes narrowing. "Who lost the red marker?" she demanded. Kelly's group mates shrugged, looking confused. They hadn't even used the red marker yet, but Mrs. Miller's eyes zeroed in on Kelly. "Of course," Mrs. Miller said, shaking her head. "Kelly, did you lose it? You're always so careless." Kelly looked down at her desk, feeling the weight of the accusation. "No, I didn't touch it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Miller leaned down, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, sure. You never admit to anything, do you? Always playing innocent." Kelly could hear the whispers from the other kids. Some were giggling again, while others stayed quiet. But no one stood up for her. The lump in her throat grew bigger, and this time, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the tears from spilling over. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she cried in front of the entire class. For a moment, there was silence, and then Mrs. Miller, standing at the front of the room, crossed her arms and smirked. "Crying won't help you, Kelly. You need to learn to take responsibility for your actions." The cruelty of Mrs. Miller's words hung in the air, and Kelly felt as if her heart was breaking. She wished more than anything that she could just leave. The classroom no longer felt like a safe place. Every day, it was becoming more of a nightmare. What Kelly didn't know was that her father, the principal, had been walking by the classroom at that very moment. He had heard Mrs. Miller's harsh words through the open door and had stopped in his tracks. Principal Johnson stood quietly outside the room, listening to the way his daughter was being treated. His heart ached, but he didn't step inside just yet. He wanted to see how far this would go. Kelly had never told him about Mrs. Miller's behavior, and now he could see why. The teacher was cruel, targeting his little girl for reasons he couldn't understand, but he had to handle this carefully. He didn't want to make things worse for Kelly, so he decided to wait, watching and listening closely without revealing that Kelly was his daughter. As Kelly wiped her tears and tried to focus on her work, Principal Johnson knew that he had to do something, but he needed more proof of Mrs. Miller's behavior before he could take action. For now, he would stay silent, but he was preparing for the moment when he would finally step in and confront the teacher who had been bullying his daughter. The weeks dragged on, and every day seemed harder for Kelly. No matter how much effort she put into her schoolwork, Mrs. Miller always found a way to put her down. One day, after Kelly had spent hours on her history project, she handed it in, hopeful that maybe this time she would get the recognition she deserved. She had followed every instruction and worked harder than ever. But when Mrs. Miller returned the graded projects, Kelly's heart sank. There, in big, bold red letters, was a giant D. Kelly could hardly believe it. Her paper was covered in red marks, with comments like, "Not good enough," and "Did you even try?" scribbled in the margins. As if that wasn't bad enough, Mrs. Miller stood at the front of the class, holding up Kelly's project. "This," she announced, "is an example of how not to do your work." She shook her head, her eyes full of cold disapproval. "Some students just aren't cut out for success, no matter how much you push them." The words echoed in Kelly's ears. Her chest felt tight, and tears threatened to spill over, but she bit her lip and held them back. She didn't want to cry in front of everyone again. Still, the pain was unbearable. How could Mrs. Miller be so cruel? Mrs. Miller continued, not even glancing in Kelly's direction. "I've tried to help this student, but it seems like she just doesn't care." The teacher's voice was cold and final, as if she had made up her mind that Kelly was nothing but a failure. The other kids stared at Kelly, some whispering, others just watching in silence. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run away, to disappear. But before she could react, something unexpected happened. The classroom door opened, and in walked Kelly's dad, Principal Johnson. He had a calm, serious expression on his face, but his eyes were hard, filled with anger he was trying to contain. The entire class fell silent as they noticed him standing there. Mrs. Miller turned around, her smile fading. "Principal Johnson," she said, her voice faltering. "What a surprise. I wasn't expecting you." Principal Johnson stepped forward, his eyes narrowing at Mrs. Miller. "I've been watching, Mrs. Miller. I heard everything." Mrs. Miller's face turned pale. I don't understand. What do you mean?" Principal Johnson looked at his daughter, his heart breaking for all the pain she had endured in silence. He turned back to Mrs. Miller and said, "Kelly is my daughter." For a moment, the room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Mrs. Miller's eyes widened, and she stumbled over her words. Your daughter. I didn't know. I had no idea." But Principal Johnson wasn't interested in her excuses. His voice was steady but filled with anger. "You've been treating her unfairly, bullying her, and humiliating her in front of the class. And not just her, Mrs. Miller. You've been cruel to other students who don't look like you. I've seen it. I've heard it." Mrs. Miller's face flushed with panic. She stammered, "Principal Johnson, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just discipline. I was trying to help her, to push her to do better." Principal Johnson shook his head, his expression firm. "This isn't about discipline, Mrs. Miller. It's about respect. And from what I've seen, you've shown none." Mrs. Miller's hands trembled as she tried to explain herself. "I'm sorry, truly. If I had known she was your daughter, I would have." But Kelly, who had been sitting quietly through it all, finally found her voice. Her heart was pounding, but she knew she had to say something. Slowly, she stood up, her hands shaking. "It's not about me being his daughter," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It's about how you've been treating me, how you've been treating other kids." Mrs. Miller looked at her, wide-eyed. I didn't mean to." But Kelly didn't let her finish. "You made me feel like I wasn't good enough. You made me feel like I couldn't succeed, just because I'm different." She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "And it wasn't just me. You've been mean to other kids too, just because they don't look like you. That's not right." The class was silent, all eyes on Kelly. Even Mrs. Miller didn't know what to say. Principal Johnson stepped forward, his voice low but powerful. "Mrs. Miller, we cannot allow teachers who bully and discriminate against students. This school is meant to be a safe place for all children, no matter what they look like." He took a deep breath, his eyes locking on Mrs. Miller. "I'm suspending you, effective immediately." Mrs. Miller's face crumpled. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She knew there was nothing she could say to fix what she had done. As Mrs. Miller gathered her things and left the classroom, Principal Johnson turned to the class. "This is a lesson for all of us," he said, his voice calm again. "We must always treat each other with respect and kindness, no matter our differences." Kelly was brave enough to speak up, and that's something we can all learn from. Kelly sat back down, her heart still racing, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. She had stood up for herself and for others, and it made her feel strong. The weight of Mrs. Miller's bullying was finally lifted. After school, as Kelly and her dad walked to the car, she looked up at him and smiled. "Thank you, Dad." Principal Johnson smiled back, resting a hand on her shoulder. "No, thank you, Kelly. You're the one who made a difference today." As they drove home, Kelly felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had not only changed her life, but also made the school a better place for everyone. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe for more heartwarming videos.